I'm sorry, I'm an energetic.
Can I do that myself? Can I turn the... Yeah.
You can turn your own volume down.
Okay.
Yeah.
What?
Okay, stop it.
Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. My name is Jody Avirgan. There are 2 weeks left until Election Day, and this marks the kickoff of our daily or near daily podcast countdown to the big day. So listeners, we're going to have a bunch more podcasts in your ear holes over the next 2 weeks. Ear holes, you like that?
Ew.
That wasn't even in the
Disgusting.
script. I just vamped that.
Disgusting.
Yeah, you like that? Look, now that we are 2 weeks away, there are a few things that we want to dive into. One in particular, the races are starting to heat up. We're getting more and more data. And one of the most intriguing pieces is in regards to fundraising. Last week, campaigns released their latest fundraising numbers, showing Democrats outraised Republicans in individual donations about 2-1. So here to discuss what that says, whether it says anything about Democratic enthusiasm, how we should work it into the model itself and the models in our heads and in our hearts. Editor-in-Chief Nate Silver. Hello, Nate.
Hello, Jody.
Okay.
That was pretty good.
Good hello.
Good hello.
On a Nate grade, that was a B+. Claire Malone, politics writer, is here. Hello, Claire.
Hey, Jody.
And managing editor Micah Cohen. Hello, Micah.
Hello.
Can you hear the chapstick that Micah just put on as I was introducing the others, listeners?
I got chapped lip.
Yeah, it is chapstick season.
Did anybody buy lottery tickets?
No.
What's happening?
Oh, Tony did.
It's massive. That's all I know. There's like two massive.
The Mega Millions is like
$1 billion.
I don't know. Yeah, $2 billion or something.
See, I don't want to win that lottery.
Really?
Well, your chances of winning are very slim, but the I don't want to win is new. I've never heard anyone say that. You don't want $2 billion?
I don't know. I had to think about it, actually. That's a lot of money. That's like you have to feel guilty about your wealth money, and you
can give it away.
Yeah, you can do
Yeah,
whatever.
but you have to think of how to give it away properly.
Oh, the guilt.
You can hire someone for that.
Yeah.
That's true.
My favorite kind of journalism around these moments are the articles where they're like, well, it's a $2 billion thing, but after the government takes its part, it's only like several $100 million. It's still a lot of money.
What's funny, though, is a lot of offices, have like they buy office, whatever. But I think because 538 is, let's say, an unusual type of office, nobody in the office
We're
has
so
brought
rational.
Up, well, the lottery is a total scam, but
Who's the most? I didn't know about it, but who's the most likely person to buy a lottery ticket in the office?
Tony Chow, clearly. He's in the control room, holding up, waving his tickets in the air. Already serving his 2-week notice.
Nate, you didn't buy any tickets?
Robbie did.
There we go. That says a lot.
The rationality
That
doesn't...
says a lot. Okay, so look, we are going to talk about fundraising, and we're also then later in the show going to talk about the newly released governor's forecast and look at the dynamics playing out in governor's races around the country. But let's begin by checking in on the forecast overall, which we'll kind of basically do every time we gather and chat from between now and the election. So Nate, want to give us the top line numbers on where we're going to talk governors later, so where the House and Senate forecasts stand?
In the Senate, the story has not really very much changed. For a few weeks now, it's been in the range of a 4 and 5 chance for the GOP, and that's roughly what it is. Sometimes it ticks up to 7 and 9, sometimes it's 4 and 5, but it's been around an 80% chance. You've seen a couple of states where there have been somewhat better polls for Democrats, but it's a heavy lift. We're still not seeing polls in North Dakota and Montana and a lot of states that are pretty interesting. We've had polls of Indiana, which is a little off the radar, but they're contradicting one another. We've had contradictory polls in Arizona. The Senate's a heavy lift for Democrats, and that hasn't improved much.
Very quickly on that polling question, we haven't gotten polls in states that we feel are pretty important or significant. Is that just simply because the local polling is hard to do and it's expensive, and whoever's planning to do it is just going to wait until the last possible moment? And what's going on?
Well, Beto O'Rourke is the third branch of government, so you can understand why there are 100 different Texas polls. No, look, I think some states are thought to be harder to poll. Indiana, for example, you're not supposed to do robo-polls. They have a
because they're all out playing basketball.
All out playing hoops this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
North Dakota, there's no party registration or no voter registration at all, is my understanding, and that makes it more challenging.
Because they're all out playing hoops.
No, they're fracking.
Where do they play? They're fracking and playing hockey, I think. Curling.
Okay, yeah.
Is there curling up in North Dakota?
They're fracking, going to those strip clubs.
We are like caricatures of coastal elites.
Yeah.
No, North Dakota has a ton of fracking.
I've been to North Dakota.
Look, if we hadn't already alienated every listener from North
Midwest.
Dakota, they would be very upset.
Oh, yeah, my
at
long-standing rivalry with North Dakota.
So, are we expecting to see some polls in all these states?
I don't
or is there
know.
a chance we go all the way to Election Day and we just don't have a high
I don't know. I
poll
mean,
in some key states?
Fox has been polling North Dakota periodically is one of the states they're hitting, and Indiana, so good for them.
Look, North I think Dakota poll since October 2nd.
Yeah, look, I think so. Really, since Heidkamp's vote on Kavanaugh, and she's had other controversies too that probably aren't going to play well for her, frankly. But poll North Dakota, somebody. It should also be said in 2012, you also did not have very many public polls in North Dakota, but the Heidkamp campaign and Democratic groups would put out polls showing them ahead or at least in a tight race. And so, I'm not a huge fan of internal polls. Our model does use them, however, and you would think that if they had a reason to want to convey optimism that you get a poll like that at some point, and you haven't had one. So that's a little bit of a tell.
What state also hasn't been polled in a long time? Montana. September 28th.
Wow. September 28th.
Another fracking state. Maybe it does have to do with fracking.
I don't think Montana has a lot of fracking. But I will say I think I would be interested to see another Montana poll post-Kavanaugh vote.
As Nate always says, rather an internal poll than no polling. That's a long time Nate saying.
It's a greeting card saying.
It's a new Nate saying. It's a Nate 2.0 saying. Look, I think Montana and Indiana are two states where Republicans have been very bullish, and they will periodically put out polls showing them tied or up 2 or down 2 that are campaign or affiliated polls or party-affiliated polls. The public polling in those states has fairly consistently shown Democrats with the lead. And so we don't really know whether Montana and Indiana kind of line up in this likely Democratic category where they could lose them, but probably that means things are going pretty badly overall, or if they're more in the toss-up / lean Democratic category, in which case they're more central to the story on November 6th.
Micah, real quick, and then we should move on to the fundraising question, which obviously plays into a lot of this as well. But we've talked a number of times about how 80% is the kind of spot that makes us a little nervous, because we've noticed that people kind of round all the way up to 100 when a forecast is at 80%. It's ticked up a little bit. It's at 86 in the classic for the House, and then it's just under 80 in light, and deluxe is around there. But is there a point at which it pushes past the nervous-making zone and is high enough that we feel we're back towards people should assume this is?
It's funny because it's half what our forecast is showing and half what the media narrative is. Yeah. So in 2012, for example, we had Obama as Nate, an 89, 90% favorite?
90. Yeah, I think 91 or something on Election Day.
Which is a strong favorite. But the media narrative was that it was a toss-up, and anybody who tried to say, one candidate or another had an advantage was reading entrails rather than accurately describing the data. This year, I actually I was asking people about this the other day, but I'm not quite sure what the consensus is on the House.
I'm not sure it is either.
I think data-wise.
Narratively. Data-wise, it's clear. Right. Democrats are a strong favorite, but not a prohibitive one. But what's the media consensus on Democrats' chances in the House?
There is this weird consensus that the House is shifting back to the GOP. The Post, for example, had an article on that. I think that's not a credible case. You have to cherry pick your way through generic ballot polls that have gotten worse for Republicans, through awful third quarter fundraising numbers for Republicans, through a lot of pretty bad district-by-district polls for Republicans. I don't think that's an accurate depiction of the lay of the land. We can debate our Democratic chances 70% or 80% or 95%. And we haven't given our numbers, I guess, so I should do that now.
Yeah, right? Democrats are at an all-time high in our House forecast.
Yeah,
they are 86% favorites.
In the classic version, we should say this is the time of year when we recommend looking at the 3 different versions. So the deluxe version accounts for expert forecasts like Hook Political. They're a little bit more hedged, so that's 83. The light version, which is polls only, if you don't buy these fundraising numbers, which have a big influence on the other 2 forecasts, the Democrats are at 79. So if you just want to remember, if you want to round things off, it's about 80% on average between our various forecasts in the 2 chambers. 80% for Democrats in the House, 80% for Republicans in the Senate.
Let's start to transition a little bit and talk about some of these fundraising numbers. So, Claire, do you want to just kick us off? What are your thoughts about this kind of remarkable fundraising advantage that Democrats are showing?
I think it speaks to, obviously, a great deal of enthusiasm on the Democratic side. I think some of it is from politics becoming more pop culture-y. I mean, I think we pointed out in our couple of election updates that these fundraising numbers are historic. Is that a fair word to put onto the fundraising numbers? And I think you're seeing a lot of small dollar donations, which we've talked about before on this podcast as, something that's becoming for Democrats this really important litmus test. How are you doing with small dollar donors? And so I think it's an interesting number to pull out. And I think post 2016, you have seen this sort of extraordinary groundswell of, yes, enthusiasm on the Democratic side, but just politics becoming pop cultural lingua franca. And I think that filters into donations. It's interesting.
I buy that Democrats not only would have a fundraising advantage because Democratic enthusiasm seems up this year, but that the Pod Save America portion of the Democratic Party is new and super active and donating. I don't have any data to support that, but anybody else buying that?
No, I don't, because it's extremely widespread. I mean, I think this is about targeted digital appeals, about people having more awareness of their local congressional candidates as politics becomes more of a spectator sport, so to speak. But we actually showed a big jump in the number of candidates who raised certain thresholds. So we had an article about how many candidates raised $1 million in the House, raised $2 million. We saw big jumps between 2014 and 2016. Actually, 2014 was a year when participation was low. 2016, obviously, politics got kind of more crazy. Democrats have continued to build on that, whereas Republicans have really retreated. That gap comes from, and again, in swing districts as well as all districts, Democrats have outraised Republicans based on public funds 2-1 so far. And there's nothing like that going back as far as we can see in the data. But that has two causes, which is both Democratic fundraising is good and Republican fundraising is bad, or at least bad relative to these higher thresholds that both parties had been setting in recent years.
So I want to get to the second part about Republican fundraising being bad, but just to this notion that, do you not buy that there's an element of kind of a nationalized interest in this midterm and some machinery, whether it's podcasts or Democrats being smart, by getting
podcasts move to polls?
Well,
no, that's not.
But, no, you were framing it as a proxy.
It's the idea that Pod Save America is the new fireside chat of the establishment progressives.
But do you not think that there are liberals around the country who are kind of finding it cathartic, or however you want to characterize it, to donate in small amounts to a bunch of different races that they're being
this is the podcast election. And no, I mean, how
do you not
think
that's a phenomenon? Forget podcasting. Let's just say people in Maine sending money to Beto O'Rourke or to some other place as a sort of way to show their enthusiasm.
Looked so much at the in-state versus out-of-state spreads. I think sometimes there's mythology around them that might not hold. I think actually Beto has raised a higher proportion of his money in-state than Ted Cruz has, if I remember that right. I mean, certainly there's some tactical spending where Democrats are more aware now of what the competitive races are, but the fundamental characteristic of this House playing field is that it's extremely large. We show, I think the classic version of our model shows 115 seats that are competitive. The deluxe version hedges on the upside there, so it's more like 100. But still, if we had run a model at this point in 2016, it would have been 40 or 45 seats. And so
that's crazy.
There are 2 or 2.5 times as many seats in play. And a lot of that is because Democrats nominated credible candidates who have raised a lot of money. And so they have a lot of lottery tickets districts where they have a 10 or 15 or 20% chance of winning. And they'll win, mostly not, but they'll win a few of those likely.
Nate, you were saying earlier that people didn't quite appreciate how huge the Democratic advantage seems to be on the generic ballot or the national popular vote, which it's up to 8 or 9 percentage points. Are the fundraising numbers in line with that, or do they speak to an even bigger Democratic advantage?
No, they're probably a pinch better. I don't know if we actually calculated what if you only used fundraising to make predictions, but I tried to do a quick version of that. And so Democrats have about a 2-1 edge. If you look historically at House races that where a party has a 2-1 edge, it wins on average by 10 or 11 points. And so that would suggest it's a couple points better even than the generic ballot.
So let's get to this connection and whether there is a connection between these fundraising numbers and enthusiasm. Claire, do you want to start? Do you still feel like fundraising is the single best way to measure enthusiasm at this point? Do you trust that this is a measurement of high enthusiasm?
No, I mean, I think one thing we haven't talked about is it's also easier to make donations. It's getting easier and easier for people in whatever state to transfer money to the candidate that they like. So I think political donations, just by virtue of, the Venmo era, people are just thinking of easier ways for people to give. And so people who are more engaged voters are more likely to give those things. But I still think it's most useful to look at, or it is incredibly useful to look at poll surveys of likely voters and to say like what percentage of people are actually, they are almost positive that they will go out and vote on election day. Because, I don't know, I would be interested actually to compare percentages of people who donate to percentages of likely voters. I'm sure donations are much lower. Like the number of people who donate is lower than likely voters.
Yeah.
But I would be interested to see whether or not that's like, I don't think there are numbers on this, but whether or not the numbers have mirrored each other.
It's interesting because as I said earlier, I have this sort of same initial skepticism of the fundraising numbers. Not that they're meaningful. I think they are meaningful of Democratic enthusiasm. But just because they're so out of whack with history and somewhat out of whack with other indicators that you're a little skeptical of them. But I don't know. You're right that it has gotten easier to donate money. But has it gotten easier in a way that would exacerbate differences in enthusiasm? You get what I mean? It's gotten easier across the board.
Yeah, it's not like we're like, oh, well, we know Democrats overperform in small donor fundraising.
Right.
This hadn't happened until this year, and it's a big difference. I almost feel like the fundraising numbers are a little bit underrated.
Counter-take.
That was a counter.
Okay, I don't even think I had a take.
But no, go
Let's say that you're skeptical of the polls and you're not allowed to use polls in an election forecast. Then what would you use?
Fundraising.
Micah would read entrails?
You'd use fundraising. Would be one of the first things you'd use. Yeah,
I would look
and
at
so
entrails.
like, another thing you might look at, we don't use this in our model. We think we don't need to use it. It doesn't help when you have polls, but like you could look at special election results, right? Those two things are good, tangible, real indicators of real behavior, and they're both really good for Democrats, better than the polls are. And so if you say, oops, never would trust a poll, now you have to construct a forecast without a poll, it would probably be better for Democrats than the forecast out there.
I was actually thinking about this over the weekend, that if not for 2016, when a lot of left-leaning model makers got burned, I feel like we would have this year some like models that were like just fundraising and special elections, and they'd be saying, oh, 538 is way too skeptical of Democrats showing only a 40-seat gain on average. They should actually be showing a 80-seat gain.
Well, your point earlier, I'm not quite sure what the conventional wisdom is this year.
Right? No, it's
maybe it's actually not that misplaced. I mean, the fundamental story is that you have a clear but not overwhelming favorite in both chambers, and they happen to be the opposite parties from one another. If that's your basic take on the House and the Senate, then we're not really going to argue with you that much.
No, that generally agrees with our forecast. But one thing the media isn't great at doing, which generally this is like a little bit nitpicky, but is talking about the like upside and downside cases. So if the fundraising numbers have gotten less coverage than they should, I think it's because it's hard as a reporter to describe uncertainty and to say, hey, this is our read of the race, but if these fundraising numbers are right, then maybe it's a tsunami.
I do also think that the fundraising story has largely been about O'Rourke's campaign in Texas, and I just think it's sucked up a lot of air, to be honest. Where are you reading besides us all that much about across the board spikes in fundraising? I don't think it's a prevailing narrative. I think the prevailing narrative is O'Rourke raised a ton of money in Texas.
But that was the sort of, I thought, most fascinating thing about the analysis we did last week was that there was this like weird mini narrative like a week or two ago that like, oh, Democrats are over donating to O'Rourke and it's under, and they're not spreading their money around. And our analysis showed that no, they actually are. As Nate said, it's in these very competitive districts where they do have a genuine fundraising advantage.
Yeah, that's a lazy narrative. I actually, one thing I do think where the conventional wisdom is a bit wrong, and you were hinting at this, is like, I think people underestimate the chance that Democrats could win 50 seats in the House. I think people underestimate the chance that Republicans could actually gain like 2 or 3 or 4 seats in the Senate, those are both outcomes that are in the like meaty part of the probability distribution. Those are not things that are like just, if something crazy happens, right? Those are both like entirely plausible outcomes, and I think people would treat them as shocking, and they shouldn't. And they can go back and play this podcast. If Democrats win 50 House seats, if Republicans win 3 Senate seats net, like those are pretty typical kind of outcomes that we could fairly easily see.
I mean, our 80% confidence interval, which, as Nate says, that's like the meaty part of the bell curve, runs from Democrats gaining 16 seats, so falling just short of taking the House, to 60 seats.
Yeah.
So to be clear, that's 80% confidence interval. The curve extends well beyond that, right? So
let me ask one other question about fundraising. Then maybe we can talk about Republicans very briefly. But this is mostly speculation, but may be worth just asking. Is there any chance that that all this fundraising enthusiasm, all these individual donations happening mostly online, would have any sort of undermining effect for Democrats in that it's cathartic, it feels like you've done your part, and so then maybe people don't go to the polls because they've mashed that donate button a bunch of times? Is this I don't actually believe this, but I just figure it's worth asking.
That's like saying if someone paid $100 for like a Big Mac, would they not eat a Big Mac for free if it was offered to them because they're already satiated?
What does that mean?
No, I don't know what that means, but I'm pretty sure it's not a good metaphor.
If you paid $100 for a Big Mac,
voting is free.
Yeah, but voting's harder than sitting on your
money.
computer and hitting the button. That's my point. Like, how much confidence do we feel like it'll connect between doing the easy thing, as Claire said, to doing what is proven to be a pretty hard thing, which is go to the actual polls?
Maybe you're different. Most people, Jody, would say, I would rather spend some time than spend money. Right. So free, people don't think about their time value of their,
I value my time way more than I value.
Good. As in, like, you
money.
don't want to entertain this question anymore and we should move on and stop wasting your time?
Here's what about this? As inequality has increased and as the parties have sorted more by proxies for income, like education, could there be something there that fucks up how indicative fundraising is?
Usually when something like that happens, you see it happen gradually, and then we'd say, can we build in some adjustment to our model for this or that, because we know, but like, it just happened all of a sudden. I mean, look, the Occam's razor explanation, we haven't used that phrase in 2 or 3 podcasts, is that Democrats are really enthusiastic and charged up, and Republicans are not, and that is very dangerous for Republicans. I mean, it's not necessarily that complicated.
That's a convincing
razor.
Kind of falls in the uncanny valley for me, though. No.
What other podcast cliches can we use? Okay, very briefly, any thoughts on, we talked about there's a big Democratic advantage, but there's also a suppressed, or however you want to call it, Republican fundraising levels. Is that manifesting itself in any particular way that is like races that are being hurt by it, or what's going on there?
So in 2016, 64 congressional campaigns on the GOP side had raised at least $2 million 20 days before the election. This year, instead of 64, it is 17. That seems significant. And
that's small donations? Are they making up for that in any other way with PACs or any other kind of money?
Yeah, there was a report out today or yesterday or something that showed that like Republicans actually have more cash on hand at this moment, which accounts for the kind of big dollar fundraising where the GOP has some advantages. But like Claire's right that I would pay more attention to the small dollar donors because one, it's just more, it feels like it could be more indicative of voter enthusiasm. But two, like, look, these campaigns combine what Claire just said about, fewer GOP campaigns being well off with what Nate said earlier about the playing field being particularly broad this year. Those have the same cause to some extent, but they also make it really tough for Republicans. And I think that's why you see these reports of them sort of like triaging races and cutting off funds.
Yeah, I wonder if Republicans aren't making a little bit of a mistake there. Because like one place...
In what? In triaging races or not triaging enough?
In triaging too many races and not spreading out the wealth a little bit more. I guess not a very Republican thing to do. But look, where our model, if we are like, we have a big confidence interval, as we mentioned. If you look at the number of gains, we're more optimistic because we expect this very large menu of likely Republican districts for Democrats to pick a few of those off. And a lot of them are because, like, you have a district that's 15 points Republican leaning, but the Democrat has outraised the GOP incumbent 4-1. And maybe the district's a little bit quirky, and it tends to be more of a purple district at the congressional level than for president or something else, right? I mean, I would be really scared if I were the GOP that, like, some places where I'm not paying much attention to. Because remember, like, only 45% of the country turns out for the midterms. Maybe it's going to be up to 50% in some districts this year. I mean, it will be in some. You know, if turnout is that low, then if one side's voters turn out and yours don't, you can be in a pretty darn Republican district and lose. And the fact that you have these candidates who have not faced a competitive race in years, all of a sudden are raising $300,000 and their opponent has $1.5 million. I mean, I'm not sure what to make of those races, but, like, it wouldn't, like, leave me to sleep easily at night if I were a Republican.
Okay, we're going to leave it there, and we're going to talk about the governor's races next. But first, let me tell you that today's podcast is brought to you by WeWork. Whether you are a team of 2 or 200 at WeWork, space matters. From single-desk solutions and innovative amenities to flexible private offices designed to grow along with your headcount, WeWork gives your business the space you need to connect, focus, build, and succeed. WeWork now has over 280 locations across more than 70 cities in 24 countries around the world, making it the perfect partner for your next satellite office, regional headquarters, or remote employees. This kind of thing can be one of the things that really bogs you down as you're trying to grow a business, both where's the space for the people who are in our office, but also we have an employee in this country, we have an employee in this city. WeWork will help you figure that out so that you can focus on your business. Your team members spend over a third of their lives in your office space, so why not make it exceptional? Everything from IT and maintenance to security, cleaning, wellness programming, and cold brew on tap. Say that again. Very important. Cold brew on tap is handled by WeWork. WeWork provides the intentional design, infectious energy, and outstanding service your team needs in order to just show up and do what they do best. And if you listen to our live podcast, you'll know that they will show up and do what they do best, surrounded by many plants. Very good plant game at WeWork. Visit WeWork.com to find a location near you today. Once again, that's WeWork.com. Today's podcast is also brought to you by ZipRecruiter. Hiring is challenging, but there's one place you can go to find hiring that is simple, fast, and smart. It's a place where growing businesses connect to qualified candidates. That place is ZipRecruiter.com/538. ZipRecruiter sends your job to over 100 of the web's leading job boards, but they don't stop there. With their powerful matching technology, ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes out there to find people with the right experience and actively invites them to apply to your job. That's the recruiter part of ZipRecruiter. As applications come in, ZipRecruiter analyzes each one and spotlights the top candidates so you never miss a great match. This is the biggest fear. I felt it myself when you're trying to hire, that there's a diamond in the rough out there and you're not going to find it because this can be such an overwhelming process. ZipRecruiter goes out there and spotlights the top candidates. You will never miss a great match. ZipRecruiter is so effective that 80% of employers who post to ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within the first day. Think about it. You post, all of a sudden you're getting quality candidates one day later. With results like that, it's no wonder that ZipRecruiter is the highest rated hiring site in America. Right now, you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/538. That's ZipRecruiter.com. Use the numbers /538. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. We're back, and let's talk about our newly published governor's forecast. 36 states are electing governors this fall, and we are going to look at the most competitive and consequential races. And I'll say there was a great model talk last week with Nate and Galen on this. Lots of questions, both wonky and top line, were answered there. If you didn't get a chance, go back and listen, but we'll talk about it here as well. Claire, in a general sense, how important are gubernatorial races for parties and for policies on the ground? We tend to focus on the congressional race and the Senate race, but, what's at stake here?
Well, dearly departed Harry Ensign and I wrote a story last year together about the historic ebb in power of Democrats nationwide, and it had a lot to do not just with their losing the White House, but the fact that over the course of the Obama administration, they had lost control of state houses and quite a few governor's mansions. You can check that story out. I don't remember the name of it, but it's like Obama won the White House, Democrats lost the country, something like that. But
it's not a bad headline.
Yeah,
I probably wrote it.
It's all Micah, guys.
The most earnest man in
I'm just a marionette being pulled. Micah's pulling the strings. But governors obviously wield a lot of power in the sense of they can veto bills that come before them in state legislatures. And I'm not the first person at all to point this out, but there are quite a few voting rights laws that people talk a lot about right now, as far as the election being in a couple of weeks and then 2020 coming down the line. So I think people are paying a lot of attention to governors' mansions in part because of the big losses that Democrats had during the Obama administration, and now they seem to be paying attention to state-level offices in a way that Republicans, to their great credit, kind of did for a long time, and Democrats are now sort of catching up to that.
The other thing is, because Republicans, one, have been focused on this, but two, just because they made up so much ground during the Obama years, they're now incredibly overexposed at the state level. It's kind of like the inverse of the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Let's dive into some specific races, and let's start our tour of the nation in the Southeast with Florida, a race that we've talked about a number of times. But Micah, what's going on there? What are
this was the forecast I think that most surprised me, where we show Andrew Gillum, the Democrat, as a pretty healthy favorite, a 7-9 favorite. Ron DeSantis, who's a former representative from there, is a 2-9 underdog. It's gotten a lot of attention. I think I would have expected Gillum to be ahead, but I don't know. 7-9 is a pretty healthy favorite, isn't it?
That's 14-18. It's remarkable.
70-90.
It's 78% chance.
What is it? Is this an indicator of the national environment? Is this an indicator of something's happening in Florida? Or is this say something about Gillum himself?
Florida's a weird state. It's got a lot of interesting political trends contained within it.
It contains multitudes.
It does.
Nate?
It's Whitman-esque.
There are a ton of polls in Florida, although there was a brief pause with the hurricane affecting the Panhandle. And they all show the same thing. In some ways, this is one of the most straightforward races anywhere in the country. In any governor's house or Senate race to forecast is almost all the polls have Gillum ahead. Some of them have him way ahead. Some of them have him narrowly ahead. But they all have him ahead.
No, but the question is why do you think he has such a healthy and consistent lead?
Because it's a purple state in a blue year. Mm-hmm. And you have two candidates who are respectively pretty base-driven, pretty liberal, and pretty conservative, right? I mean, I might say I think one of them is performed better at the debates or whatever, right? But this is what you'd expect, kind of, right? You would expect in a purple state in a year where the generic ballot favors Democrats by 8 or 9 points. Generic ballot translates pretty well in the governor's races. You would expect the Democrat to be ahead if the candidates are equal by 6 points in an environment like that, right? And that's what the polls show. And so, I don't think this requires that much explanation. I think people bring a lot of assumptions to the table because Gillum is black and but DeSantis is
pretty
white and very, I was going to say very white, but very conservative.
Gillum himself, there was a debate last night as of us taping this. The lefty parts of the internet seem to be very taken with Gillum. Is there any anything to that?
They were always taken with Gillum, but he's a good candidate.
Right, but this isn't really about the governor's race, but is his stock rising? Is he someone who will show up in future conversations about presidential campaigns or anything? Or?
Sure. But the bar to get into conversations about presidential campaigns is pretty low. But no, I think there are a few governor's races this year where, depending on the result, you will see these people
break out,
pop up in conversations about 2020 or 2024, and Gillum is one of those people.
So maybe another one on that list is in Georgia. There are some similar dynamics in play, some similar candidates. So there's anyone want to lay out the odds, and then we'll talk about why those odds stand where they are with Abrams and Kemp.
Kemp is a 5-9 favorite. Brian Kemp, Secretary of State of Georgia. Stacey Abrams, the Democrat there, is a 4-9 underdog. And there's a Libertarian Party candidate
who makes our model
with less than a 1 in 100 chance of winning.
Holler.
So Ted Metz, as I learned in Model Talk, is included because he's included in all of the polling. And so if you're getting the polling, then you get to be in our model.
So Claire, tell us about Ted Metz.
Yeah. Let's go from the bottom up. Tell us about Ted Metz.
Well, he has the same last name as a New York sports team that is also a perennial underdog.
Who should spell it with a Z.
Only
which would really
Claire
improve their brand.
Could give a good answer to that question.
So, Claire, what are you watching in this race? Are you surprised that
I am not watching Ted Metz.
Yes.
I think we've talked about this on other podcasts, but I think Stacey Abrams' candidacy is a very interesting one because of her proposition that she can help herself to victory by, yes, winning over Republicans or Republican-leaning independents who are kind of like, I don't feel great about the Republicans or Trump right now, perhaps. But also, she's counting a lot on turning out African-American voters, making sure that community actually votes in this election. And I think it's a similar interesting case with Gillum in Florida, where we're sort of changing like what kind of candidates can win a race like that, where you really need to turn out your base, but you also need to win some of those moderate voters. And Stacey Abrams is a black woman, and it's America, and so it makes for interesting dynamic. She's also running against an extremely conservative guy in Kemp, who is the Secretary of State. And I don't know if I'm sure listeners of this podcast have heard quite a bit about the voter roll controversy happening in Georgia, where thousands of people are currently sort of suspended from the rolls, many of them African American. So
if Ted Metz spelled his name on the voter rolls with an S instead of a Z, he would have to vote provisionally.
Yeah. Can I also just this is something we haven't talked about in a while, but the other thing I think about with races like Georgia, where there's already a lot of doubt or disillusionment with the system of voter registration, I do start to think about, we haven't talked about this in a while, but election meddling. And I did some reporting on this in the spring, but one tactic that election security experts talk about as a very effective one, potentially for sowing doubt in our elections if a foreign entity decided to insert themselves, would be to screw with voter rolls so that when people showed up at the polling place, they would be turned away. And you're already seeing there's huge pre-election controversies in Georgia, just exactly to that effect. And so it does make you think about Election Day itself. In 2 weeks, what could things look like in Georgia or in certain counties in Florida? Whatever it might be, that is a thing I think election security experts think a lot about and worry a lot about.
The good news is Florida just has such a sterling track record when it comes to...
But this will matter. Here's a hot take for you guys.
Okay.
I think the governor's races... the last time I said this is a hot take, you all gave me shit because you said it was a conventional wisdom. So maybe that's the case here. But
Mike doesn't get out much.
But
Mike is currently cooling off his take before he even says it.
I think while the governor's races have gotten far less attention than the races for the House and the Senate, I think they're going to have an outsized role in the interpretation of 2018, where likely Democrats win the House, Republicans win the Senate, keep the Senate. Very likely Democrats will make gubernatorial gains, so I think that will help give the post-election narrative a blue hue, right? But also, going into 2020, if Gillum wins, if Abrams wins, and in particular, if they win by turning out non-white voters, by turning out young voters, then that offers one interpretation. If they lose, but Richard Cordray in Ohio wins big and Scott Walker gets blown out in Wisconsin, then that's sort of a different interpretation. I'm not saying it should be different, but that's my hot take.
Let's say our forecast goes more or less to plan. Democrats win 37, let's call it, House seats. Republicans gain a net of 1 seat in the Senate. Maybe there's one race still uncalled, but not enough Democrats to win. Democrats win most of these big governor's races. Maybe they win Florida. Georgia's going to a runoff, which can happen in Georgia. They win all of the Midwest. Beto loses by 7 points. What do you think the narrative is? What's the headline in the New York Times the next morning?
See, here's what makes it difficult is weirdly, and it shouldn't, but I think it will, I think it'll come down, it'll be very marginal. In other words, let's say Democrats don't lose a Senate seat. They just, the Senate stays the same. Then I think the headline will be, Democrats make big gains in House, governorships, hold steady in Senate. If Democrats lose 2 seats in the Senate, then I think it's more, the headline is more equivocal.
That's true. I tend to think that the media will be bullish on Democratic outcomes no matter what, in part because it's where the interesting stories are. I see a lot of pushing of the year of the woman on the Democratic side. there's also the idea that Democrats are in some ways a more interesting narrative because you're interpreting into the 2020 primary. I mean, people are going to start announcing their candidacies post haste after the midterm results. So I think there's going to be a tendency to be like, ooh, well, this person lost, Beto O'Rourke, perhaps.
Yeah.
But they did extremely well, and it's sort of, like losing your way to winning a spot in the primary, that kind of thing. Like, I just think that there's going to be a little bit more of like
they will default towards big night for Democrats.
Yes.
In rebuke to Trump, TK. And the subline headline is, but Republicans expected to hold Senate or something. I think, right?
No, that seems right.
Although if they just go to the finish line, if Democrats win the House, and by the way, when we said Democrats have an 80 or 85% chance of winning the House, that doesn't always mean that 80 or 80% of the time they do it without a sweat, right? That includes the scenarios where they win it by 1 or 2 or 3 seats and where we have to wait for recounts and mail ballots to come in from California, and it's really a sweat. And by the way, also, when Republicans win the House, that 15-20% of the time, that's often a sweat too. In fact, those tend to be very close outcomes.
But let's bring it back to the governor's model just very quickly, and then we'll start to wrap up. But Nate, let me just ask you, and I'll say that you and Galen did a fair amount on the Wisconsin race specifically during Model Talk. So let me ask you a larger question about the Midwest. Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Michigan are all looking poised to elect Democratic governors. Wisconsin leans slightly blue. Ohio we have as a toss-up. This is a part of the country that went for Trump. So what's going on here?
Jody, are you familiar with the statistical precept known as reversion to the mean?
Only because I listened to the hit podcast from 538.
So what happens is that when one party does really well in one election, then it tends to regress to the mean in subsequent elections. The very places, Jody, where Donald Trump...
Is this how you're going to talk on ABC on
Keep
election
doing
night, by the way?
it. It's a pretty good talk show.
Where Donald Trump did the best in 2016 might be the places where you have the biggest fall off. Voters aren't necessarily bought into the Republican brand. They might not turn out. So the Midwest is often where the current swings the strongest.
I feel like we need some sound effects here.
I find that voice more pleasing to my ear than their normal voice.
But why the Midwest specifically?
So shady.
But wait, but actually, I will push you a little bit on what you just said in that amazing voice. The very place that was a stronghold was the most likely place to swing back.
Because these places are places where Trump overperformed in 2016. And therefore, you can have underperformance as a result of voters who are either tentative fans of Trump. Remember all those undecided voters who, after Clinton campaign in Wisconsin, Michigan, after Comey, they all kind of went to Trump in those states. Those are the rule in politics sometimes last in, first out. If you're a swing voter and you swung to Trump, you might not be as strong a Trump approver as someone in Georgia or Tennessee, for example.
There are also states that were traditionally associated with the Democratic Party, if you're talking about like the old school union model of things. Like I think Connor Lamb's election in Pennsylvania was sort of a really interesting crystallization of this, where Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin, all industrial Midwest states with maybe more culturally conservative voters, but voters who are very used to family ties to the Democratic Party and, maybe pro-union ties in their past. And I think that those kinds of voters in the Midwest tend to float a bit more.
Let's remember, too, that undecided voters for Congress, so people who were agnostic between Clinton and Trump, also voted very strongly Republican for Congress by like a 2-1 margin or something, because they thought that Clinton would be president and therefore you wanted a Republican to balance. That balancing instinct is strong, too. People were like, oh, how can Trump's approval be up, but the generic ballot is getting worse than the GOP? Well, you'd actually usually expect the generic ballot to lag Trump approval because, voters who are indifferent toward Trump, and there aren't many, but there are a few, might say, hey, look, Republicans are in charge of anything. I'm on the fence about Trump. Let's put some Democrats in Congress to check power a little bit. And that's one of the fundamental reasons why there's almost always a swing against the president's party at the midterms.
Wait a second. Has the Midwest reverted to the mean, or are Democrats outperforming there?
Well, nothing has happened yet. People have to vote.
The only poll that matters.
No, I'm saying, in our forecast. You get what I mean?
Yeah.
It seems not only has it kind of reverted a bit. In other words, Republicans are not outperforming there. It seems like Democrats are out.
Like it's a Democratic stronghold potentially now. It's swung from stronghold to stronghold?
Yeah, maybe not quite stronghold, but yeah,
certainly all these Senate races that Republicans had some hope of making competitive. So Michigan,
Wisconsin,
Ohio,
Minnesota.
Pennsylvania, which I consider part of the political Midwest.
Okay, yeah. I'll go
Minnesota,
with you.
the special election in Minnesota, the polls are all over the place, and so that race is at least on the radar. There are 2 elections in Minnesota for Senate this year.
Even Donnelly in Indiana is like a pretty strong favorite. Not an
Well, it depends on
overwhelming
if you
one.
trust this American Viewpoint poll.
Claire, any thoughts on this?
I have thoughts on Ohio, which is that I think it would have been a closer race if Josh Mandel hadn't had to drop out and Renee C. took over as a Republican nominee kind of like halfway through the cycle. Also, Sherrod Brown's particular brand of Democrat-ness is extremely adept to the Trump age and to Ohio in the Trump age because he has long been anti-free trade populist. So.
Yeah, he's doing really well. Will the post-election narrative be Democrats come back in the Midwest, or the Midwest has swung wildly Democratic?
If Scott Walker loses in Wisconsin, I think that has an outsized effect.
Yeah.
Okay, we got to start to wrap here. Let me see if I can't offer power rankings of the remaining governor's races in terms of interestingness. So Kansas, Alaska, Nevada, those are like the top 3. Anyone got any final thoughts on that?
No.
Anyone others?
I mean, Alaska, you had the independent incumbent drop
Yeah.
out of the race, which gives Mark Begich, former Senator Mark Begich, a much better chance because you basically had a left-leaning independent, and they were splitting what there is of the center and the left vote in Alaska, and so now that race is more competitive.
Mm-hmm.
I think Kansas is really interesting.
Kansas is interesting.
Why is Chris Kobach doing so poorly there? I mean, he's the favorite, but like a pretty meek favorite for a Republican in a red state.
First of all, Micah, partisanship is only about a third as powerful in governorships as it is in races for Congress.
That's a good factoid.
So therefore, Kansas in a governor's race is the equivalent of like Ohio or something, or not even that maybe.
Awesome.
Or North Carolina in a Senate race. Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the point of that story.
Similarly, awesome.
The point of that story is that Ohio is awesome.
But that's also
so genuine. You were just like,
It's true Ohio pride.
that's also a race where, I mean, Ohio, we did this exercise. If you, listener, either had to spend the rest of your life in Ohio or you were
Yes.
randomly assigned to one of the other 49 states,
49.
equally weighted, and again, you have to be that state your entire life.
I would take the field in a second.
Clay, you would take
There are
Ohio.
a lot of states.
I would obviously live in Ohio.
Yeah, that was-
like
yeah.
obviously, it is currently like my number 2. Like if I had to move out of New York, I would move to Ohio.
Wow.
Just,
my
Micah,
God.
let me
Above like pretty much most other places.
just look at a list of states, Micah. There are a lot of states.
There are 49.
I don't want
Did
to
you know there are
insult
49
I don't want to
non-Ohio
insult
states in the country?
any states, but like there are a lot of states.
This is, by the way, one of Nate's favorite games. His answer is California, right?
Yes,
Like,
obviously.
I'm a beach person, though. So I wouldn't.
But
wanna
you're a
go
shore
anywhere, go
person.
there.
You're a
Do
shore
not go
person.
there.
That's not the same thing as the
Okay.
beach.
I'm really trying to cultivate this persona as I'm like very against the heartland.
So okay, let's start to wrap up. Any bad things to say about either of the Dakotas, Micah, real quick before we wrap?
I mean,
Or should we
how
move
much
on?
time do you have?
Yeah, okay. Okay, we're going to end it there. Before we go, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our friends at ABC News and their daily morning podcast, Start Here. We have all been on the show a bunch talking about random stuff. We tape in the same studio, so it's nice to be in the same room as them. The show comes out each morning. It covers the big stories of the day, but also goes into some of the original reporting that's happening across ABC and 538 and elsewhere. So I know people's appetites for news is ramping up, especially as we get to the last couple weeks before the midterm. So check it out. You can just search Start Here in your favorite podcast app, and we will keep popping up there from time to time. So go find it. Editor-in-Chief Nate Silver, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Claire Malone, thanks to you.
Thank you.
And again, if the New York Mets would like to change their name and spell it with a Z, all you have to do is just credit Claire Malone at 538 for that idea. Micah Cohen, thanks to you.
Thank you.
My name is Jody Avergan. I want to give a quick shout out to the New York men's ultimate team, Pride of New York, which I played for many years, and they won a national championship yesterday. It's a big thing in my world. Galen Druk is our producer. Tony Chow is in the control room. Remember to tune back in tomorrow because we're going into daily politics podcast mode. We'll be talking about topics like voting laws and campaign ads. You can get in touch by emailing us podcasts@538.com. You can also, of course, tweet at us with questions or comments. If you're a fan of the show, leave a rating or review in the Apple Podcast Store. When you leave a rating, it helps our rankings, which helps others discover the show, or just tell someone about the show. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.